Entrepreneurial Edge is brought to you by Business Banking from FNB, because small ideas can lead to big business. FNB, how can we help you?
Hello and a warm welcome to the Entrepreneurial Edge. I'm Natasha Jacobs. Entrepreneurship is regarded as one of the most powerful drivers of economic growth and prosperity. Yet South African entrepreneurs are seemingly still finding it tough to find their feet. What's keeping them back, and what is the current state of entrepreneurship in South Africa? That's the hot topic of discussion on today's show. But before we get into the thick of things, we recently attended the launch of the third edition of the Entrepreneurial Dialogues, the state of entrepreneurship in South Africa. Let's take a look.
Recently, Endeavour, in partnership with FNB and SAP, hosted the third edition of the Entrepreneurial Dialogues, the state of entrepreneurship in South Africa, the key archetypes of an entrepreneurial culture, in Rosebank, Johannesburg.
A while back, a few months ago, toward the latter part of 2011, FNB, together with its co-sponsors and partners, primarily Endeavour and SAP, gathered what we thought were at the time were probably the brightest minds in terms of trying to solve for some of the entrepreneurial problems existing in South Africa. And I think our key goal was to try and determine the key archetypes of entrepreneurial activity, not only in South Africa, but across the world. And today's event was to launch the key insights gleaned from that. So as part of that process, we interviewed and spoke to a number of key stakeholders and role players in the industry to try and find out how is it that entrepreneurial activity firstly begins in South Africa, and secondly how to get it going, how to almost remove the inertia that we faced with.
During the conference, the key issue was raised of how important entrepreneurship is for job creation in the country.
If you look at countries developing going forward, we need to encourage people to be, job givers as opposed to be, job seekers. And again, from an Endeavour point of view, then identifying, those up and incoming entrepreneurs and supporting them. And in a South African environment, finding that, again, the purpose of today and doing research about what is the state of entrepreneurship in South Africa, you realize that as a country we have many challenges.
The conference also touched on the ideal ecosystems for entrepreneurs based on key archetypes as identified by research conducted by the Monitor Group in 26 countries.
We find entrepreneurship in South Africa at a particularly interesting point. Compared to and given our perspective that we have globally, we see that the recognition and the connection between prosperity and growth in a country, job creation and entrepreneurship has been widely recognized. A multitude of initiatives have been started, but the missing point to actually start moving the needle with regards to job creation out of entrepreneurship, we see is a multidisciplinary initiative that actually gets the right stakeholders around the table and a facilitated process and the data on the fundamental barriers. So what we see is a lot of measuring of symptoms, and a lot of opinion on what could be driving those symptoms, but we haven't yet seen the research that unpacks the fundamentals as to what needs to be overcome to actually see the needle move in terms of true entrepreneurs as opposed to survivalists.
Now joining me in studio to discuss the state of entrepreneurship in the country is Malik Fal, outgoing Managing Director of Endeavour, Head of Business Acquisitions at FNB Sanjeev Ori, and Tebogo Squambane, Global Partner at the Monitor Group. Gentlemen and lady, welcome to the show. Malik, I'm going to start with you. Let's start with an overview of the landscape. Now, in 2004, the South African government pledged to halve unemployment by 2014. That year, unemployment was sitting at 27.9%. Last quarter of 2011, 23.9%. After 8 years, a decrease of only 4% certainly is underwhelming, to say the least.
Absolutely. South Africa is facing the same challenges that many emerging markets face when it comes to unemployment and entrepreneurship. But as you pointed out earlier, we all believe that entrepreneurship has a chance to change those figures, in particular in South Africa. The challenge has been sort of manifold. I think the simplest way to put it is that there's a need for policies at the high level in terms of policies to sort of facilitate business and entrepreneurs to sort of function, and then at the micro level to sort of support entrepreneurs by access to capital and business skills. And sort of getting that mixture right has been the challenge in South Africa.
So, Jeff, speaking of the mixture, historically we've seen society looking towards government to create job creation. But is this realistic? Where is the private sector in creating that balance and that mix?
Yeah, I think the balance is a difficult one to achieve. I think what is happening as well in terms of just pure stats that are coming through, I think government and the private sector is pretty much constrained in the number of jobs that they can create. We saw a recent spike in money supply toward the latter part of last quarter, and I think the thinking was that a lot of it was informal money coming into the system, and I think the hope was that we're doing more and more in terms of entrepreneurial activity. So I think entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial activity in trying to achieve or to help get that balance right is absolutely critical for us. And from a banking perspective, from an F&B perspective, our role and our participation in this event is to try and understand and get to better grips around what it is that entrepreneurs need and want, and to somehow try and facilitate that, and as a bank to either provide the funding or provide the value adds, the features and benefits to facilitate that.
Now, another factor we need that Malik touched on was policy and framework in the country. Does South Africa have an enabling environment to foster entrepreneurial growth?
I think we've got a long way to go in South Africa. The environment is not sufficiently conducive to fostering entrepreneurship. I think that all the relevant constituencies have a role to play, government, private sector and entrepreneurs, and we actually have to work together. We have to collaborate in order to create that environment that can foster entrepreneurship.
Let's look at some of the stats when it comes to entrepreneurship levels in the country. Performance on the TA index, the total entrepreneurship index, has improved from 5.9% in 2009 to 8.9% the year before last. Statistically, we are, however, lagging far behind our emerging economic counterparts like Brazil. Why is this figure so different to what's going on in the rest of the world?
Well, the participants at the summit sort of saw different reasons for that. And the one that sort of touches across the board seems to be a cultural one, which is difficult to put a finger on because it's one of the softer reasons. And particularly towards, attitudes towards entrepreneurs. So it seems that in South Africa, people favor the more traditional track of getting a good degree and working for a good, respectable company.
So going through the corporate ladder.
That's right, exactly. And then secondly, also around more specific attitudes towards business failure, for example. In some parts of the world where that are entrepreneurial hotspots, the tolerance for business failure is far higher than in South Africa, and it makes it easier for people to go into business for themselves.
Speaking of business failure, appetite for risk, obviously funding of these entrepreneurs. From a funding perspective, have you seen an increase in the amount of first-time entrepreneurs and ventures coming to your bank saying, please assist with startup capital?
I think the funding debate is a very curious one, because from a banking perspective, the bank makes money on both sides of the income, on both sides of the balance sheet, sorry. And for us, I mean, it makes perfect sense to extend as responsibly and sustainably as possible as we can with credit facilities. But what we're finding is that only 8 to 10% of customers who actually apply for the facility take it up with us. So it's a curious anomaly in the sense that there's probably still fear around the facility. There's probably still the contagion from international markets, and a lot of people who say to us, look, I've qualified for the facility, but I'm a bit afraid. So again, closely aligned to what Malik is saying, I think it's cultural. There's generally a fear of becoming an entrepreneur, and I think also just around the education and the training aspect of it. So how do I manage a facility if I actually get it? So from a banking perspective, we'd love to extend as many facilities as we can, as long as it's sustainable. But I think, yeah, there are a number of attitudinal issues that we need to get to the bottom of, Natasha.
But it is risky business, though, venturing, and Malik just said some countries have an appetite. If a person fails, they can try again, apply for funding again. Is it that same model applicable in South Africa?
I think to a large extent, if anything that came through from the white paper was that the archetypes or the models of entrepreneurial activity that are universally acceptable and fairly generic across the world would work, and probably do work as well in South Africa as well. But I think, again, it's a lot to do with attitudinal. I'm fairly fortunate in the sense that I lecture at a university in Johannesburg, and a quick acid test for me is to ask students, do you want to be an entrepreneur? And two stats emerge for me, and it's fairly anecdotal, but the low percentage of students who are willing to take that risk, and I think there's just generally less glamour associated with an entrepreneurial career. I think people understand that or the perception is that it's difficult and that they'll struggle, and it's probably easier in corporate or in public sector. And then the second stat that emerges colleges is that so many people, so many students are probably enrolled in the wrong degrees. So again, there's just a lack of passion for it. So I think from an entrepreneurial perspective, if this is your passion, if you want to be self-employed, if you want to make a meaningful mark, I think that's the agenda and that's the debate that we need to get to the bottom of, Natasha.
So Borgo, it's also about a culture of entrepreneurship. He's just saying that, that there is a lack of passion for the industry and perhaps the skills taught in high school and university not conducive to creating an entrepreneurial environment. From a global monitor perspective, you guys monitor various economies around the world. What is South Africa getting right and what are we getting wrong?
Well, a couple of things. One is I think that we do need to look at our education system across all levels, starting from grade 0 on up, and take a look at what are the messages that we're sending to young students around entrepreneurship, around the career options that they have. I think we've got a long way to go there as well, right the way through to grade 12 and around the sort of tertiary opportunities that students look at. In our studies that we've done around the world, and we'd like to do a similar study here in South Africa, and hoping to launch that this year, we'd really like to better understand exactly what are our strengths and weaknesses around this issue of education, around this issue of culture and attitudes to entrepreneurship. And we found in other markets that there's a lot that you can actually do, that it's not a done deal, that our culture is as it is and it cannot be addressed and cannot be changed. And we'd like to have that opportunity to have those sorts of discussions in South Africa.
Fantastic. Let's take a quick look at the macroeconomic climate. Of course, the financial meltdown of 2008, 2009 is still reverberating through the markets. Have we ever seen an uptake in people who might have been laid off from corporate saying, I might be able to do this on my own, to anyone?
Just in terms of the number of business cases that FNB is seeing, I think so. Again, one of the archetypes that were identified in the white paper was the external trigger model, and I think this great recession, as it's now become called, is giving rise to it. So we're seeing a significantly more or significant new number of business cases coming to the fore. I think the quality of the business cases and the quality of the ideas are probably not at the same level as some of the Western countries. So I was reading an interesting stat around the US, for example. The number of entrepreneurs that are starting up business now rivals what was, I think, probably in the last decade, just at that .com era. So again, I think it's an international trend, and I think it's translating into South Africa as well.
Malik, have you seen the number of entrepreneurs knocking on Endeavour's door saying for assistance and support increase?
Not directly, but one of the specific things that I think is specific to South Africa along the sort of event trigger model that Sanjeev is referring to now, is that one of the anomalies is that apparently the level of entrepreneurship in South Africa in the Afrikaans community has increased tremendously in the past few years. I don't have the specific numbers by community, but it's a perfect example of that sort of event trigger, the event being the BE code and so on, which means that it's far more difficult for white folks and Afrikaner folks, for example, to find jobs in the public sector and even in the corporate sector. But that what ended up happening is that many people in this community, for lack of other choices, have become started businesses, and many of them are creating amazing businesses as we speak. Apparently, like around the Pretoria ring, so to speak. So this is exactly what we're talking about. But the idea is to have government official and the private sector leverage those events to sort of foster, potential entrepreneurs, and that's what's been problematic.
So have you seen this on a global front as well?
I think to a certain extent in some markets, yes. I think in South Africa what we're probably witnessing or will see the effects of shortly is even if you haven't been laid off, you're sort of looking at what's happening to other people and what's happening in other markets to say, well, I don't want to risk that. I don't want to be in that sort of that same position. I've got some ideas. I'm willing to go out on a limb now before I'm desperate. I belong to an organization called Entrepreneur's Organization. I was once also an entrepreneur, started my own consulting firm. And the event that triggered that was the firm that we had been working for left South Africa. We started our own firm. So I joined Entrepreneur's Organization, similar to Endeavour. It supports entrepreneurs, provides a network for entrepreneurs. And we've seen a sharp rise in a number of applications for membership. And I think that's an indication of what's going on in South Africa and the potential that we have going forward.